This week, our module will focus on language and communication, and specifically talking about how fully elaborated spoken language is this unique purvey of modern Homo sapiens. So, we will address what makes language different from other forms of communication. Specifically, we will look at animal call systems. We will also ask how do anthropologists and linguists study human language in general, and then specific language or language properties, and then how language changes over both the short and long term time periods. Language, both written and spoken, is humans' primary means of communication. We rely on language every single day. It's transmitted through learning, like culture. And so, last week when we discussed these features or these defining features of human culture, remember that we talked about how it's culturally transmitted, it allows for or relies on symbols, etc. These qualify for language too. Language is symbolic based on these arbitrary learned associations between words and symbols and the things that they stand for. So all of those defining features of human culture also are defining features of human language. The advantage that language gives us is that it allows us to conjure up elaborate images. I'm assuming many of you have read, for example, Harry Potter or The Hunger Games. Think about reading those books and then think about the movie adaptations. Um, the uh, the books conjure up, or the words used in those books, the way that the authors describe the characters, the places, conjure up really elaborate kind of images in our brains that give us this notion of how Harry or Hermione or Katniss and Peeta are going to look. And in many cases, then, when we watch movie adaptations, particularly if we've read the books first, we find ourselves disappointed in the way that characters are portrayed in the movie adaptations. Now, though, when I read Harry Potter, I picture Daniel Radcliffe as Harry. I picture Emma Watson as Hermione, and I can't kind of revert back to those original images that my brain had decided to describe the characters. So, what we're able to see through language in our brains is pretty phenomenal. Language also allows humans to discuss the past and the future. It allows for what we call displacement, where we are able to discuss things that have either occurred in the distant or not so distant past, and we're able to make plans for the future. We are able to share experiences with others. Remember that culture is shared, well, language is shared too. It doesn't do much good if you're the only one who speaks a certain language tradition. You've got to have people with whom to share your experiences. And then it also allows us to benefit from others' experiences. And this is perhaps arguably the most important adaptive function of language. Language allows for something called cultural consolidation. What this means is that we don't have to directly experience events to be able to solve those events. As long as someone in our group has experienced those events and then shared that knowledge of those events, and that knowledge has been passed down through oral traditions, we have this built up cultural kind of catalog of ways to cope with rare events. And so, there might not be anybody alive who has dealt with a particular, let's say, a 500-year drought cycle, or a migration patterns, or rare weather events, or diseases that come through. With cultural consolidation, with this knowledge that's built up over subsequent generations, it doesn't matter whether anyone alive has experienced that event, you still benefit from how people coped with those problems in the past. Anthropologists study language in both its social and cultural context. So we will talk a bit about what we call descriptive linguistics, and how language structure is studied, but we will also critically talk about how language is used in this cultural and social context. So we'll start with discussing non-human primate call systems. Call systems are communication systems of really any animal. It doesn't just have to be non-human primates, but we are talking specifically about non-human primates because, of course, primatology is the purvey of anthropologists as well. Call systems use a limited number of sounds that are produced in response to specific stimuli. Generally, these sounds are automatic and cannot be combined. And at some point, then, during our development as hominins, our ancestors began to combine calls and to understand combinations of calls. And so, specifically, what's pictured here, this is a vervet monkey. Vervet monkeys share their territories with baboons, with chimpanzees, and these call diagrams, these images of sounds over on the left that are pictured, represent different predator calls. Over on the right, we've got depictions of what kinds of predators might be grouped together. And so the reason that we use vervet monkeys in a discussion of call systems is because they have hardwired predator calls. And so even captive vervet monkeys, if they've never been exposed to, let's say they've lived their whole life indoors, and they've never been exposed to particular predators, they still, when faced with pictures of those predators, with videos of those predators, with taxidermy stuffed specimens of those predators, they still will make the appropriate species typical alarm call. And so generally for avian predators, that means like hawks and eagles, birds that are coming from above, that alarm call is going to be kind of diffuse, very high pitched, very hard to localize. And the reason behind that is because avian predators circle above until they can pinpoint a single animal. Once they pinpoint that single animal, they very quickly swoop down and pick that animal off. And so by having diffuse, hard to localize calls for avian predators, you reduce the likelihood that you as an individual are going to be picked off by a predator. By contrast, the calls they have for terrestrial predators, so this would be things like snakes, like large cats, etc., are very localizable. And what they do is they incite what we call a mobbing behavior. So basically, the vervet monkey starts yelling, "Snake, snake, snake, I see you, snake, everybody come over here, there's a snake." And then the other animals respond in kind. They all approach, they stand around the snake, they will all make that same alarm call until the snake finally gives up. And so the reason behind this is that terrestrial predators, snakes, large cats, etc., rely on stealth. And so once they've been identified, once the animals are able to locate them and see them and mob them, they've lost that element of surprise. They've lost that advantage that stealth gives them. And so they generally end up slinking away unsuccessfully. So we see very specific predator calls that respond to the methods in which different types of predators hunt. Now, how do we know these are hardwired? Well, it's because we can take animals that are in captivity and expose them to these stimuli, these predator stimuli that they've never perhaps encountered in captivity, and they still make those alarm calls. Doesn't matter if they were vervet reared or whether they were hand reared. They can be raised by humans and then put together in a group or even singly housed, and they will still make those predator specific alarm calls. This has been done with golden lion tamarins, for example. I can't remember whether we talked about the golden lion tamarin research that was being done by the Smithsonian during our week on non-human primates, but the Smithsonian and the National Zoo have a captive breeding program for golden lion tamarins. And so when they have enough animals together that they feel are sufficiently prepared, they will take them down to Brazil and they will release them in a bunch in the wild. And so the first couple times this was done, there wasn't really specific training that was given the animals. The animals were simply reared as zoo animals are, taken down in a large bunch, released, and about 50% of them died. Well, generally it's not good for conservation efforts if 50% of the young that you rear in captivity die when you reintroduce them. So they thought, well, perhaps these animals weren't trained in the ways of the wild. Perhaps if we did some kind of training, including predator exposure and the resulting alarm calls, including having access to natural food sources and having the opportunity to process those foods, maybe their mortality will drop. And so the National Zoo started to train these animals, expose them to specific predators that are found down in Brazil, also exposing them or letting them be free ranging at the National Zoo. So if you go to the National Zoo during months that are warm enough. So basically from about May to October, these animals are free ranging on the zoo grounds. They are able to nest wherever they want. The zoo has planted natural fruit trees, natural gum trees on the zoo property, so the animals have wild forage. They're exposed to the hawks and the eagles that are prevalent in that area of Virginia, Maryland. They're exposed to snakes that are prevalent in those areas. So basically, they're living a quote unquote wild in a wild environment, even though they're captively bred. So with all of this training, with all of this exposure, they then took another batch down to Brazil and let them release them in this sanctuary, and 50% of them died. So it didn't really matter whether they had training for these specific predators. Those predator calls are hardwired. Those predator calls are part of their genome. And it didn't really have a measurable effect on whether they survived or not. What it did do was generated more funds for conservation. So the National Zoo is still free-ranging these golden lion tamarins, because people are more willing to give money to these conservation efforts if they are if these animals are free-ranging. So do we see then any ability to manipulate these calls, any ability to change what they're saying? Well, there has been some interesting research done with these vervet monkeys where in captivity, when you've got high-ranking and low-ranking individuals, they were able to detect these predator stimuli equally, and they called equally. When we look at wild vervet monkeys, we find that that dominant and subordinate animals detect predators just as often as one another, but dominant animals are much more likely to vocalize. So interestingly, in captivity, low-ranking vervets will use selective, basically mutism, to prevent themselves from making those calls. So even though they detect calls equally, or they detect predators equally often, they're staying silent. Why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this because by staying silent, they raise the likelihood that high-ranking individuals will get picked off, and so they they kind of lower the competition. They create the possibility that their offspring will be able to rise in rank due to these higher ranking individuals getting picked off. So this selective staying quiet maybe points to the fact that even among species like vervets that have these call systems, maybe they're not quite as, let's say, malleable or unmalleable. Maybe they're not quite as fixed as we initially thought, if animals are able to suppress those vocalizations in a context that is favorable. Now, why weren't the captive animals doing the same thing? Well, because in captivity, whether you're high ranking or low ranking, you still get food. You don't have the same degree of feeding competition, so you don't have that same payoff to high rank. You might be less stressed, you might have more mates, but it's not the difference between having access to enough food and not having access to enough food. So different behaviors that emerge that are kind of culturally malleable. There's been some work done with non-human primates with respect to sign language to see whether we know that non-human primates, great apes specifically, don't have the anatomy to enable them to have spoken language. But these sign language studies were put in place to determine whether they have the cognitive apparatus. Are their brains capable of engaging in the kinds of chores that human brains do with respect to fully evolved modern human speech? And what this has shown is that chimps and gorillas at least possess the rudimentary capacity, the cognitive capacity for language. The first to learn were Washoe and Lucy. After they learned how to sign, they could exhibit human traits like swearing, joking, telling lies, and trying to teach language to others. Washoe and Lucy critically both tried to teach language to their own offspring. Coco, the sign language gorilla, has tried to teach sign to her kittens. Now, of course, kittens don't have the same kind of cognitive apparatus, so those kittens were unable to pick up American Sign Language. This was followed by Project NIM. Project NIM had less impressive results. NIM Chimpsky, first of all, was not able to demonstrate the same kind of capacity for language, and was eventually then sold to a biomedical facility to have kind of a sad life outcome. In fact, there was a Hollywood film produced a decade or so ago called Project NIM that starred Jodie Foster. You may watch that for extra credit. So if you would like to take advantage of that opportunity, I will I'll make an assignment tab for that. It's not required though, so that score would be worth 5 points added to one of your exam scores. And so for that, you would watch the film, you would write a 500-word essay. That essay would be two-thirds summarizing the information from the film, what you learned from it, one-third personal reflection. So, did that change how you think about ape language studies? Were you not impressed with the movie? Was it poorly done? Exploitative of wild animals, etc. It doesn't really matter what your personal reflections are, as long as you include those personal reflections. Sign language among great apes, what we've been able to see with the kind of cognitive work that it's exposed, is that great apes are capable of some of these defining features of language. So these bold terms are considered defining features of language. We're talking about them in this context here with these great ape language studies, but if you were to face a question on your exam this week that says, what are the three, or which of the following is not one of the three defining features of language, these would apply to spoken human language as well. And so one of the defining features of language is that it is culturally transmitted. That means it's transmitted through learning. So all humans, for example, are born with a equal capacity for language unless they have some kind of developmental problem with their brain development. So what we find with non-human primates is that they engage in cultural transmission of learning as well. So they're born with that cognitive capacity. Whether they learn it or not is going to be based on exposure. For us, we are born with an equal capacity for language, but the actual language that we express is going to be based on the languages that we are exposed to. And so Washoe and Lucy both tried to teach ASL to other animals, including their own offspring. The second defining feature of language is productivity. This is that language has rules, and that using the rules of language can allow for the creation of new expressions. Language rules can be used to produce new expressions. And so Coco, Washoe, and Lucy all created new words from their existing language rules. These included things like drink fruit for watermelon, water bird for swan, finger bracelet for ring. And so we do this all the time. When you look at how children acquire language, you see that they will put together words that they have to try to describe things they've never been exposed to. So I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head for my own children, and of course I can't pull one kind of immediately. If I, through the course of the lecture, think of one, I will bring it up. But the point being that when we're faced with something new, we can put together words from our own dictionary to try to describe that new experience, that new object, etc. The third feature of human language that great apes utilize in their sign language is displacement. That is the ability to talk about things that are not present. And so this can be either temporally or spatially displaced. Coco and and Washoe and Lucy were all able to talk about things that were in the other room. They have, for example, object permanence. That means that even if things are not present in the room they're in, they are able to still describe them or refer to them. They don't. It's not an out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And then temporal displacement means that when time has passed, we can still talk about events. And so Coco has in the past expressed sadness about biting Penny. She also, when she didn't want to do something, she would sign later to kind of put it off for a future time. There does remain a question with these ape sign language studies about, particularly when they're reared in human-like environments, or they're treated as if they're the human siblings of human children. Do they understand whether they're different or not, or do they think of themselves as human? And Coco, when asked to describe herself, signed that she was a fine animal gorilla. So does seem to be that kind of latent ability to be able to recognize oneself as different from the human caretakers with whom one is engaging. Some interesting work has been done with bonobos, not with sign language, but with language boards. These are called lexicograms. And so this began with the LANA, or Language Analog Project at Yerkes in the 1970s. They found that chimpanzees and bonobos could distinguish between symbols. They could arrange them grammatically. They could create novel combinations. Much subsequent research has been conducted at Georgia State University with Sue Savage Rumbaugh. In recent years, Sue has had some ethics allegations against her. And so that research has been halted. These animals have been moved to Iowa State and are basically living out their lives in a bonobo sanctuary, where they still have access to these language boards, but they're not being actively studied. Sue Savage Rumbaugh used a keyboard that was developed by her husband, Wayne Rumbaugh, that included 384 non-iconic arbitrary symbols. What we mean by non-iconic is that there was no relationship between the symbol and what these things stood for. So you didn't just take a picture of an apple and then put that on the board as the symbol for apple. Rather, you were using symbolic kinds of representation. So an apple might be a circle with a line drawn through it. This is important because this more appropriately measures linguistic ability. I mean, when we think about our alphabets, about our dictionary, our language is not iconic. There's nothing inherent in the letter A that makes it say an A sound, right? It is a symbol that we have then associated with certain sounds. The same thing can be said for the words that we use to describe things. There's nothing inherent in APPLE, pronounced apple, that describes what an apple is. However, if I use the word apple, you can immediately conjure up images that describe an apple. So you might say red, you might say green, you might say crisp, you might say juicy, you might say fall fruit, so on and so forth. We would be able to adequately use our language rules then to talk about apples. With this keyboard, when an ape presses a key, a digital voice says the word. The lexigram is also displayed on a computer screen. And so you see here common chimpanzees having access to these language boards. Further research with social chimps has showed that they can use these boards to communicate with one another. So they would structure their interactions with other animals who know how to use these boards. They wouldn't try to take a naive animal who's not been trained in this language and try to plan with them. They could categorize, they could pretend, they could plan, comprehend, respond to one another. They could structure interactions around statements of planned intent. Bonobos have excelled with this, and so Kanzi is perhaps the poster child of Sue Savage Rumbaugh. He was a 9-month-old infant bonobo who wasn't even actively being trained. His mother was being trained, and Kanzi just passively picked up these language skills. He spontaneously demonstrated productive competence for lexicograms. That means he could use these lexicograms to communicate with individuals, human individuals or bonobo individuals. He also had a receptive competence for spoken English. So you could ask him questions without using the board, and then he would utilize that board to respond. This emerged from passive observational exposure, not from active training. His utterances include grammar syntax and semanticity. So he uses the rules of spoken English to structure his lexigram replies, and his language skill has then enhanced his ability to learn other skills. So he is able to, for example, flint knap. He can manufacture Oldowan style pebble tools that are very similar to what Australopithecines would have been able to produce. And so through linguistic and language skills, he has an enhanced what we call metacognition. He's got other cognitive things that he's capable of. Kanzi can start fire. Um, Kanzi can drive a golf cart. Kanzi can engage in tasks that are very quote unquote human like. And so there is a TED Talk that's going to be posted in your learning activities. And actually, there are 3 TED Talks that are going to be posted in your learning activities. The first is this Sue Savage Rumbaugh TED Talk, in which it's not explicitly structured around language. It is more the what they call the gentle genius of bonobos, but you were able to watch it as one of your 3 options. So this week for your learning activities, you need to pick one TED Talk to watch and write a response for. And so in this TED Talk, you will see Kanzi's other skills. You will see his flint knapping. You will see his ability to both light fire and to extinguish fire. You will also see another individual, Pan Benicia, who has picked up writing with chalk on the tile floor of the research building. She's also used sticks to write with to draw these lexicograms out on the forest floor. So you would look at you would watch this video, and you would specifically address some of the key factors of language that are expressed in this video, not so much the key factors of other cognitive skills. There will be 2 others that I'll mention in the scope of the lecture, so you don't have to do the kind of primate language cognition TED Talk. You can choose one of the others if you'd like. So the community for these bonobos includes a 50-acre wooded forest within a 300-acre woodland preserve. They have unfettered access to the 50-acre forest. However, they can put on an institutional collar and a leash, and they can go within this 300-acre woodland preserve. These locations are marked in the forest with lexicograms. The bonobos know the forest as well as humans know a village. They can work with one another to plan where they're going to go on a given day and what they're going to do when they go there. They talk about these plans on these communication boards. Orangutans have also demonstrated some fantastic feats of metacognition, though not specifically linguistic cognition. The zoo has something called the O-Line. The National Zoo has a think tank in the O-Line. So during nice weather, there is a tower that's in the orangutan yard at the National Zoo. There is another tower that's in the yard of the think tank, which is their cognitive research facility. And then there are cables that connect those 2 towers. Between the hours of 11 and 2, the towers are de-electrified, and the orangutans can climb up and then traverse the distance between those 2 facilities on what's called the O-Line. And so these orangutans thusly have a choice as to whether they want to engage in cognitive tests, cognitive activities, games, or not. And then at 2 o'clock, those lines are re-electrified. The orangs spend the night wherever they've chosen to end up. And so orangutans have comparable cognitive skills. So the metacognition that's present for cultural features, for cultural transmission, for productivity, for solving puzzles, etc., predates this distinction or this divergence between us and our closest great ape relatives.